I'm reviewing today Astro Boy by Tezuka Osamu. This is the Astro Boy Omnibus Volume 1. First of all, you may have noticed this is a different camera angle than I usually use. Ordinarily, when I review a comic book, I like to have the camera facing the comic book so you can see the pictures as I talk about them. And I normally set the comic book down on the bed and then hold the camera above the comic book. But for this one, just because of the way this volume is bound, if I were to sit it down, it would not open by itself. I would need one hand to hold it open, and then another hand to hold the camera, and then it would be difficult to flip through because I couldn't flip because I wouldn't have a free hand. So I've got the tripod set up here as part of the new camera. Now I can't figure out how to get the tripod pointed down at the bed. I can only ever get it pointed outwards. So it's just going to be pointed out at the wall. Excuse the clutter of this apartment. And I'm going to hold the book up like this in front of the camera. I'm sitting behind the tripod, obviously. And we'll see how this works. But first of all, let's talk about Astro Boy and Tezuka Osamu. Tezuka Osamu, or Osamu Tezuka, I lived in Japan for several years, so the Japanese way of pronouncing this would be to do the last name first, Tezuka Osamu. English is Osamu Tezuka. Anyways. Tezuka Osamu is the Japanese Walt Disney. He's often been called the Japanese Walt Disney. And he's got that name for a couple reasons. One is he was, I think by his own admission, incredibly influenced by the Disney animation style. So if you look at his animation, let me see if I can find a good panel here. You can see it's kind of Disney-esque type cartoon characters. He watched a lot of Disney as he was learning how to draw. But the second reason he's known as the Japanese Walt Disney is because just like Walt Disney, he was incredibly prolific. He wrote, I don't know how many different manga series. He had so many different series, and he started his own animation studio, just like Walt Disney. He came a little bit after Walt Disney, but they were operating roughly in the same era. I think Tezuka Osamu started writing in the late 40s, so 50s, 60s. And he outlived Walt Disney, so he continued into the 70s and 80s. But, you know, both kind of mid-20th century figures. And still remembered very fondly in Japan, even now. I believe he died in the 1980s. I lived in Japan in the early 2000s, and his stuff was still everywhere. You could buy it in any bookstore. There was a monthly magazine that came out that was just solely devoted to reprinting his stuff, which I used to buy every month at the convenience stores when I lived in Japan. I haven't been to Japan in years, but I assume he's still very fondly remembered there. And Astro Boy was his most famous creation. Astro Boy is the English name for it. Japanese version the original name is Tetsuwan Atom, which translates as Mighty Atom. But for English it was translated into Astro Boy. Now, Astro Boy is, I think, in Japan, his most recognizable character, and perhaps abroad his most recognizable character as well. There was an Astro Boy cartoon TV show that was, I believe, in the early 60s, which was in Japan, but it got shown in America. So, you know, the baby boomer generation, or I guess the younger part of the baby boomer generation, may remember seeing that on TV. Although, I don't know, let me know what your cultural experience with Astro Boy is. It was on TV in America in the early 60s, but I think it's one of those things that just got completely forgotten about, right? Yeah, I mean, it's weird pop culture. Some stuff lingers, and even though I was born long after the 1960s, I still knew about Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy and all these other classic TV shows, Rocky and Bullwinkle, that everyone ever always talks about. But I think Astro Boy largely got forgotten about. I don't remember anybody talking about Astro Boy when I was growing up in America. I don't remember that being part of baby boomer nostalgia at all. The only reference I remember hearing to Astro Boy was a Calvin and Hobbes strip. When Calvin puts Crisco in his hair for the school pictures, and Hobbes puts two little points on his head, and Hobbes says, "You look like Astro Boy." Of course, this was before Wikipedia, when I was reading this in the 1980s when it was in the newspapers. So I had no idea who Astro Boy was. I thought it was just a throwaway reference. And it wasn't until I moved to Japan that I found out who Astro Boy was. Of course, nowadays with Wikipedia, it's much easier to look this stuff up. But, if you've never been to Japan, would you have heard of Astro Boy? Have you heard of Astro Boy? Let me know in the comments down below how you heard of Astro Boy, if you've heard of him, how much you've heard of him. I did get one person comment alerting me to some of the homages in American media to Astro Boy. Like, I guess there was a character in one of the Clone Wars episodes that was based on Astro Boy, etc. So there is some, it has influenced some aspects of American pop culture. And by the way, thank you again for that comment. I always appreciate being educated on this kind of stuff. But anyways, Astro Boy, yes. Tezuka Osamu's most famous character. See, if I'm remembering the dates right, Astro Boy was published from 1952 to 1968, and there are a lot of these Astro Boy stories. The Tezuka Osamu magazine that I mentioned I bought every month in Japan always used to contain one Astro Boy story at the front of the issue. It was in Japanese, and when I arrived in Japan, I didn't understand any Japanese. I was just looking at the pictures. And the more I stayed there and the more I studied, the more I was able to understand some of it. I was never able to understand all of it. I never got completely fluent in Japanese. But I was able to understand some of it. In fact, I remember some of these stories from that magazine. So here's one about the dog Pero. The schoolboys are trying to get the dogs to do tricks. So he says, "Okay, roll over, please." And because he says please, a policeman shows up. And he said, "You called for police?" Now, I actually remember this from reading this 20 years ago in Japan. In Japanese, roll over is mawari, which is the same word for policeman. I think the policeman is someone who goes around. So, the idea of around. So when he's telling the dog to roll over, that's the same word as the policeman. So that's why the police shows up. Obviously, that pun doesn't work in English. So the translator here had to change it to roll over police to get the policeman to show up, which is, I guess illustrates the problems with translating comics from one language into another. That's I guess a fairly inventive way around that pun. Tezuka Osamu's stuff was full of puns, so makes interesting work for a translator. Anyways, back to Astro Boy. Astro Boy stuff has been translated into English. According to Wikipedia, I think it started being translated into English in 2002 by Dark Horse. And I think when I was in Japan, I had one of those English collections, Astro Boy Volume 1. And, This was 20 years ago, so my memory could be a little bit faulty. But I remember it being incredibly boring. Astro Boy was a robot. He fought other robots. There was just nothing imaginative or interesting about it. Just every issue was Astro Boy fighting another giant robot. If you've lived in Japan, or if you're at all familiar with Japanese culture, you'll know that for whatever reason, giant robot fights are very popular in Japanese media for young boys. All boys love giant robots fighting, but in Japan they really love giant robots fighting. Who knows why? So I remember reading that, and I remember thinking, oh, okay, well this is boring. But then some of the later Astro Boy stories looked really interesting. And most of them I encountered just in Japanese, which I could only half understand in Japan. But there was a lot of interesting things going on with time travel. Astro Boy's kind of abusive father came back and tried to establish a relationship with him. Come back to that a little bit later, maybe. Because these were published in the 1960s, there was some politics with the Vietnam War. That must have been one of the time travel episodes, because Astro Boy takes place in the future. But Astro Boy was trying to protect the Vietnamese from the American bombers, which is, that's something you couldn't have published in America at the time, but, this was Japan. And it just seemed like there were a lot of very interesting stories going on. And so I always thought to myself, somewhere along the line, these Astro Boy stories must have gotten interesting. They must have just started out as just stupid robot fights and then gotten interesting somewhere along the line. And I thought to myself, if I ever had access to them all in English translation, or if I ever, had access to it, it would be really interesting to just read them all through and read all those stories. I'm not sure. Again, take everything I say with a big grain of salt, because I'm going off of memories that are 20 years old now. I could just be remembering wrong. But it could be also that the stories got better over time. Or it could also be that some of the stories just weren't very good. After all, they were serialized for a long time. And in fact, Tezuka Osamu, who introduces these stories, and I guess in the 1970s, when these stories were being reprinted, Tezuka Osamu redid the introductions for them, in which he drew himself in the beginning of the story, kind of talking about them. Yeah, here he is. This is Tezuka Osamu talking about them. And he himself says in the introduction to this story, he says, let's see, can you see that? The stories in the long Astro Boy manga series are often of uneven quality. And frankly, I don't care for some of them that much. So I guess the author himself is admitting that there were some mixed qualities. So, I guess the one option is that they got better over time. The other option is that they were always of mixed quality, and you just had to, it's just a matter of selecting the good ones. This is an omnibus. And this omnibus, I think, is an example maybe of just selecting the good ones. Now, I don't know about you. I always used to get confused by the word omnibus because omni is supposed to mean all, right? So I thought, like, an omnibus is like a complete collection. So if this is the Omnibus Volume 1, then we must be working through the complete collection in order. But this isn't what omnibus means. Omnibus just means a selection. Apparently, I think the word came from the newsstands, where the newsstands used to carry a selection of magazines and newspapers. Is that right? So this is a selection of Astro Boy stories. And these stories are all great. And I suspect they're great because somebody had access to the 25 years of Astro Boy stories and said, let's just pick the good ones. Now, there are more volumes following this. There's the Astro Boy Omnibus 2, 3, 4, goes up to all the way to volume 7. But there are, I don't know how many hundreds of Astro Boy stories out there to choose from. So you're going to have a lot to choose from before you get to the bad ones. And all of these stories in here were fun to read. Now, Astro Boy himself is not much of a character. He's kind of, I don't know. I mean, these stories were written for young boys. So he's just a robot who comes in and saves the day. So you're not really looking for Astro Boy to do anything interesting. But the stories that Astro Boy gets put into can be really interesting. For example, the second story here is about a bunch of robots who are made out of dogs, who are part of an expedition to go to the moon, because it turns out that on the moon there's a lost city of diamonds that they want to excavate. And it's just really wacky in kind of a fun way as it gets weirder and weirder. The scenes on the moon I thought were a lot of fun. Then we go to a shorter story, Plant People. Oh, by the way, these stories are jumping around in publication date all over. I think they're all from, the oldest one in here is 1958, and I think the newest one in here is 63. So they're all from the 1958 to 1963 range, but within that range, they're not in order. So Plant People, about an alien plant person who lands on Earth and Astro Boy meets him. This one is much shorter. Then about a country where a robot is elected president. These Astro Boy stories all take place in the future where robots are common. But there's a plot to assassinate the robot president, and Astro Boy has to protect the robot president, and they run into all sorts of wacky robot characters here. I mean, this character whose legs and his feet keep running out, ahead of him. And it's just a lot of fun. And then there's a story about a magical robot magician who is being blackmailed by a human magician, and some interesting magical stuff going on there, and they have to fight some magical creatures like this giant magical spider. And then, this is maybe the least interesting one. This is about Pluto, this big giant robot who has to fight all the other robots. This comes back to what I said about a lot of these stories just being about robots fighting each other. And yet there's some interesting stuff in here. Some intrigue about Pluto's master and what his goal is. Pluto himself is given an interesting characteristic. And then we have... some of these stories do go on a bit. You can say I'm still flipping to get to the next one. They were serialized over several months when they were originally released. The Mad Machine, and then that's another interesting one. And then Robot Land, which is a fairy tale land filled with robots meant to resemble fairy tale creatures. And this was a lot of fun. We had robot Satan and a robot dragon, and there's a robot princess that changed into a bird at night, and they had to save her from the dragon. And it's just you know, it's kids stuff, but it's just fun fairy tale-esque imaginative stuff, and the Disney-esque animation is fun as well. But speaking of the animation, the biggest complaint I have about this book is that the pages are just too small. So let me see if I can find a good example here. There is a lot of interesting stuff going on in this book, but it's just all in these really small pages. Okay, yeah. Here's a good example. See, I'm having trouble getting the camera to focus, but I mean, you can see, you want to just be able to enjoy these pictures and these kind of, it's not great art, but it is kind of fun Disney-esque cartoon type stuff where you want to just enjoy the fun of it. And instead, I kept thinking that it was straining my eyes to look at this. Now, maybe take me with a grain of salt, because I have been informed by the eye doctor that as I approach middle age, I might be getting to the age where I need reading glasses. I've managed to make it without them so far yet, but maybe younger me would have had less of a complaint about this. But when these were originally published, they were published in a magazine, so they didn't look like this. They would have like a full magazine cover, and just by way of comparison, this is a completely different book here. But look at this and compare it with this, right? In terms of how much page you have here. So for this, you've got all this space given to just these very simple pictures. And here, you've got all these complex pictures which are just scrunched into this page. Now, it's tempting to blame the American publishers, Dark Horse, but they're republished in Japan in the same format as well. I mean, I mentioned I used to read them in the magazine that came out monthly. But in addition to that monthly magazine, they were also repackaged in paperbacks like this. That not quite as thick as this usually. It used to be. I mean, this might be like 4 times the thickness of one of the Japanese ones. But you walk into a bookstore in Japan, at least when I used to live there, and there used to be rows and rows and rows of comic books, all packaged in this kind of size, like a paperback novel, but with the panels all scrunched in there. And so for a page like this, where there's not much going on, that's okay. But for some of these pages, I mean, I really wanted to enjoy the artwork and enjoy just the fun cartoon atmosphere of this. And instead I had, well, sorry, I take some of that back. I would normally find I had trouble adjusting the page when I would first open the book up every night. As I continued flipping the pages, I usually found that either my eyes would adjust or I would get so absorbed in the story it didn't bother me. It was something that I noticed starting the book each night. But once you're a few pages in, it doesn't seem to bother me anymore. But yeah, to sum up, it's a lot of fun, these stories. It's not, I mean, they are written for children, so you do have to kind of approach them like you would approach the Donald Duck comic books or anything else like that, as something to be enjoyed on that level. But for that level, these are quite imaginative and fun, and I was quite glad I picked this up and revisited these Astro Boy stories. So recommend.